Time to talk Buckeyes here at the Voice of College Football. Welcome in Ohio State fans and college football fans across America. We talk Buckeyes with you each and every Wednesday at 1:30 Eastern Time. Please subscribe to the channel before you get settled, like the video, and let people know that we're here talking Buckeyes. Leave those comments and questions in the live chat. We will get to them, and it's all on this guy. He's the one that showed up. And so Tony has saved the show this week. Tony Gerdeman, Buckeye Scoop. Tony, it's always good to see you, but especially this week, it's really good to see you.
Yeah, saving the show once again. I am here, Mark. Unlike my cohorts who are off gallivanting around the South and around Europe and whatever, and I am right here in Columbus, Ohio, where I should be because I know Wednesdays or Thursdays or whenever we can do the show, I need to be here. And so I have put vacations off for 4 straight years, and I am here.
Tony doesn't opt out. He will not opt out of a minor mid-tier bowl game. He won't do that. So we know what we have here with Tony. So
this is the CFP every week right here.
Absolutely it is. Yes. This is top tier stuff. Even though Tony's got his own podcast to deal with, where can people find that?
Yeah, Buckeye Weekly Podcast. You can find that at all of your podcast platforms of choice. And right now, this time of year, dropping about 2 episodes a week, sometimes a third if we feel frisky. And so, yeah, check it out.
Well, the big news of the week came down, about 48 hours ago, that quarterback Dylan Raiola out of Arizona, 2024 class, #1 rated at his position, has decided on Ohio State. Of course, we now have to wait, about 17 months to hang on to see whether he actually signs. But, of course, the early indications are all positive.
Yeah, so this was a decision that wasn't made quickly, even though he is a 2024 and he has not yet played his junior season of high school football. Comes from a serious football family, the Raiolas. Everybody knows them there at Nebraska. But a decision that is not gone and taken lightly. And Ohio State doesn't treat their quarterbacks lightly anyway. And so if the two are coming together like this, it's pretty serious. And, you know, it's forever until he signs, and it's even longer until he plays. You look at think back to C.J. Stroud didn't throw a pass until his redshirt freshman season. So think that the first time you may get to see Dylan Raiola throw the ball as a Buckeye is 2025. And to say that, to speak that, and it's like, who is even going to be here in 2025, Mark? Who knows? But Ohio State will have a quarterback room with at least likely a redshirt freshman, Dylan Raiola, and I still think obviously he'll get his 4 games in 2024 and go from there. But it's a huge thing to already have your quarterback in 2024, and they don't have anybody in 2023 yet, but that's a byproduct of everything that's happened beforehand. The quarterback room is kind of built up, and now you're not going to slow play a Dylan Raiola who wants to come aboard. So you get him now. He's the first commit in 2024. Now you just let him recruit. And if anybody follows him on Twitter, he's been pretty active since he committed, and he's, why not be the leader, the Pied Piper that brings everybody in? You see one of the reasons he came to Ohio State is you look at what the quarterbacks have had to work with this offense and these receivers. He can now be partly responsible for bringing in guys that he wants to play with. And there are a lot of them out there. And so Ohio State right now, the offense looks to be in good shape here now in the present, and also again in the future.
Quick 61 in the chat. That typically doesn't happen in 3 minutes, so we appreciate everybody being on time today. We were on time. You're on time. It's a good day. All right, get some other college football fans on in here. Let people know we're talking Buckeyes. All right, so I don't want to get my NCAA committees and boards of directors confused, because there was one board that met, the board of directors, on name, image, and likeness. And if we can do anything we possibly can to avoid that topic for 1 week, maybe. Seems like we're talking about that constantly, and I'm kind of sick of it. But if we have to talk about it, we have to talk about it. We answer all questions and comments, of course. But more interesting to me, even though it's not nearly as impactful on the sport, is what you mentioned to me before we started to record, and that's the conversation that's been had. I saw some conversations that ensued about the ACC and their structure and what that could look like. Of course, we know what the 14-team Big Ten format looks like. Just kind of set us up to what those conversations, how they are setting up right now, and what your thoughts are.
Yeah, the NCAA Oversight Committee this week made some recommendations for a couple of rule changes that they deem like non-controversial in terms of they should pass them later this month. The first one was the kind of elimination of the rules on how a conference championship game is determined, because I think the rule right now is if you have 12 or more teams, then you have to have divisions. And there are conferences that would kind of like to eliminate divisions, and this would be one way to do that. So you eliminate the rules on how to have a championship game, and now conferences can do it however they want, and that can then eliminate the divisions. The other rule was a 2-year waiver on the 25 scholarship limit cap, like each year, and just have a 2-year where you can sign as many as you need, staying under that, staying at the 85, but allowing programs to replenish their players because they've lost some to COVID. Like the COVID changed everything in terms of numbers, and now the transfer portal has changed some things. So just a 2-year waiver to let programs build things back up. But back to the division thing, I think, I saw the same thing that you saw with the ACC speculation, where you would have basically every team would be tied to 3 other teams in terms of that you play those 3 every other year, and then you would cycle through the other 10 teams through a period of 4 years, and it would allow every player to play at every venue, and it would be very easy to see the Big Ten follow suit with that. And the interesting thing about that, Mark, is it's just 8 conference games, and so that still allows you, if the Big Ten wants to play an ACC team, a Pac-12 team, or whatever, it allows them to continue to branch out and do that. But going back to the original leaders and legends, and one of the reasons that Ohio State and Michigan were split up was so that there's a possibility that they could play again in the Big Ten championship game. It never happened, and then quickly they were put in the same division. But now this would put that back into play. And I'm just wondering if the people out there, would you like to see that game 2 weeks in a row? I can guarantee you Ohio State fans would have loved to have seen it last year.
Absolutely. And you were headed in the same direction I was in terms of, yes, I don't know where the overall fan base would stand on that, because I get feedback from certain people that say this game is sacred. Mm-hmm. It just needs to be played once. It's going to be cheapened by playing it, even though it is under championship conditions the next week. You're almost negating, in a sense, what happened the week before. And I understand the point. It's a situation where there are certain arguments that come up where I'm like, this is the way to do it. This is not. This is logical. That's not logical. But I can see both perspectives here. I think it would be intriguing to see them play 2 weeks in a row. It would be intriguing to see them play in the Big Ten championship game. It would just be historic. It would be different. Takes me back to 2006 when there was the possibility of a rematch in the BCS championship game, and I was all for that, despite Ohio State already taking care of business, and it being theoretically, I don't know that this has been substantiated, difficult to beat a team in college football twice in one season, or an NFL team 3 times in one season. I hear that all the time. I've never seen anybody put the metrics to it, but I'm on the fence. Now, if we're 5 to 10 years down the road and they've played in 4 Big Ten championship games in 8 years, I may be reconsidering that and thinking, okay, the shine's worn off, the uniqueness of this, and let's get back to just the game being the game.
Yeah, I think that is a risk, although I do want to go. I will eventually have to go back and look and see, since the start of the Big Ten championship game, what would it have looked like with no divisions? And let's see how many times Michigan is in there. We know they've made 1 Big Ten championship game in the divisional setup. How many times would Ohio State and Michigan have played with a 2-team no division setup? I think that would be interesting to find out, to see, again, how likely will it be? Let's see how often it happened in the past, and that would give us an idea. I don't know that it would be also interesting to see how does this affect the teams in the West, because the West has, as I've always said, like anybody in the West can win the West. And if they're good that year, they can beat everybody in the West, and there's a good chance they can walk into the Big Ten championship game 11-1, 12-0, something like that. We've seen Iowa was one win away from playing for national or playing for the playoffs, and Wisconsin has been one win away from playing in the playoffs. And so, will that still be the case if they're not playing mostly just the Big Ten West? And what does this do for them? And I'd be interested to know how Kirk Ferentz feels about it, how, the coaches out there, Scott Frost, although, he may want to play everybody just because he's wired differently. But what do the West teams think of this? And I bet James Franklin is probably all for it. Jim Harbaugh is probably all for it. So no longer you don't have to leapfrog Ohio State to play in the Big Ten championship game is a huge, it eliminates one gigantic burden. So I think they would love it.
As long as the schedule wasn't weighted, meaning that there wasn't continued preference, and there probably would be because the rivalries tend to be distributed in those two pockets of East and West. You've got to play Minnesota, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin. There's a concentration of rivalries there. There's a concentration maybe to a lesser extent in the East, but there still is. So those designated opponents may continue to build schedules that continue to give Western Division, what are now Western Division teams, I won't say an advantage, but a better opportunity to continue to get to the championship game.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And we just recorded a podcast talking about this, and immediately you think of, well, Ohio State would be tied to Michigan State, Michigan, and Penn State. Whereas, like somebody out in Illinois is tied to certainly three teams not as good as that, or Nebraska will be tied to three teams as good as that. And then you have to wonder, well, is that fair to those four teams? And it's probably not that they would be tied together. And Penn State is probably going to have to be tied to some semblance of Maryland and Rutgers. And so it becomes difficult to figure out exactly how to do all of this and who your three teams are every year. And that's where maybe you have to break up Ohio State's annual, Michigan State, Michigan, Penn State, something like that, and bring in a Nebraska or a Wisconsin instead of Penn State or instead of Michigan State. I just don't know that the Big Ten is going to separate Ohio State and Penn State by any type of setup, because the TV really likes them.
So I'll take it to the SEC, where they have a situation where everyone plays within the division, of course, and then they play two non-division opponents, and one of those is set, just like the ACC does the same thing. One of those is a set rival, and in some cases that rival is legit. Alabama, Tennessee have been playing forever. It's a big deal, so forth and so on. Auburn, Georgia, the South's oldest rivalry, etc. But then they fill in the blank on other rivalries just to have a designated team, and I don't know why they do that or why that's necessary. Ole Miss and Vandy, Kentucky, Mississippi State, there's no connection between these. Texas A&M and South Carolina, you can't pick two schools that have less to do with one another than those two. Why do they have to play every year? I would hope that the Big Ten would assess each team and say, okay, who are natural rivals to that school? And how can we make this as uniform as possible? But if we don't make it uniform, is that if Ohio State has three and Purdue has three and a number of teams have three, but some only have two and some only have one, is that okay? And can we work through some schedule models to see if that works? Why force there to be set opponents to some schools that aren't validated by any kind of connection or rivalry?
Yeah, and the forcing of the rivalry I don't know, has it worked with Penn State and Michigan State with the land grant trophy? Penn State comes in and it's like, okay, you and Michigan State, you guys will play the last week every year, whatever. And that's been what, 30 years now almost. And it's
Yeah.
kind of something, but it's still manufactured. It's been manufactured. And so, yeah, it almost feels it's certainly not organic. And the thing about college football rivalries is the great ones are organic. And so, yeah, maybe you don't shoehorn stuff in. And I, I think why would some programs be against that? Like, oh no, we want our three team, we want to know who they are every 2 years or whatever. And it's like, well, you will know in advance, in plenty of time who the teams are, but I don't know why they would get upset about, well, Ohio State has three rivals and we only have one. And it's like, well, that's because you're Indiana. You have one rival. Like, do you want more? I don't think you do. I think you want to just go ahead and do you want to have a rivalry with Ohio State? Because we can make one if you want one. We can give you the I-71 trophy or whatever, the I-70 trophy, and now you get to play Ohio State every year. Here you go. Be careful what you ask for.
As soon as you brought that up about Michigan State, Penn State, of course, they do play at the conclusion of each season. And then once Maryland and Rutgers joined, they attached them. And that seemed to make, there's a regional proximity, of course, with the two teams. And then it was as though the Big Ten second guessed itself. So at the same time that they added Penn State, Michigan State as a rivalry the last weekend of the season, and then a couple decades later, Nebraska, Iowa, and then a few years later, this Maryland Rutgers, they kind of second guessed themselves for a few years because I knew they took a break from that for a few years. So in 2016, they broke from Michigan State, Penn State, and actually 2017 for 3 years, they broke it up. And they went with Michigan State taking on Maryland. They took on Rutgers, and they had Rutgers. Maybe they felt as though we're kind of sanctioning off Maryland and Rutgers, and they just feel like they're kind of a addendum to the league or something, and they don't really count. So we want to integrate them into this. So, but then now they've reverted back to Michigan State and Penn State. So it's kind of odd there. But I like that they went unconventional when they reorganized the divisions, and they said our only cross-division rivalry is Purdue and Indiana, so we're going to play that, and we're not going to make things up.
Yeah, I mean, and Ohio State and Illinois used to be tied together. They've got a rivalry. That's the only trophy Ohio State plays for in Big Ten is the Illa Buck, and it's like, well, that's no longer. Don't worry about it. They'll play again eventually, and it's not something that has to happen. But yeah, it's. I think it's okay to, as we're going through all of these changes, you don't have to make everybody uniform. You can, when you make everything uniform, that can almost eliminate some of the fairness you're trying to create. When you're just putting people together, well, these three natural people, these natural rivalries exist. Now we have to create unnatural rivalries, or you can just alternate who they play. Every year, and then you can eventually, maybe by doing that, something happens that a rivalry is created.
Have you figured out the way you would do it? And if you want to save that for an article, you can just give us a quick hint and tease, and then you can point us in that direction.
No, because the thing is, I will eventually try to figure out how I would do it, because you immediately think, I like the idea of you have three teams you play every year, but for Ohio State, that's automatically Penn State, Michigan, and Michigan State. And now you have to think about, but what if it's not? And so which one of those teams do you give up, and who do you change it for? Because, I don't know that Ohio State needs to play Michigan State every year. I wouldn't mind seeing them play Nebraska, frankly, or Wisconsin every year, or something like that. And I don't know that it needs to be 3 teams, but the math works out well with you play 3 teams every year, and then the other 5 teams in an 8-game schedule. If a player stays for 4 years, he will play at every venue in the Big Ten, and he will play every team twice. Whereas in the SEC right now, with the way they do some things, you'll have entire a decade without going to a place. So I like the idea of playing at every place within a 4-year span, especially somebody who travels to these games and you get to see different places and experience them. So I think that would probably be where I start, but I don't think it's a simple process to just figure out, okay, who plays who and who plays every year. And, that's what the computer programs are for. But even determining who are your 3 opponents every year, like if that's who they're going to do it, like that gets tricky as well. And you're going to have to make sacrifices, I think.
And I think it depends on the age of the person that's looking this over, because if you're 20 years old, Ohio State, Michigan State seems like, well, they have to play. It's only been since 2013 that they last did not play a regular season game against each other because they were in opposite divisions. And before 2010, there were no divisions. And there were certain teams, and Tony, you probably remember the schedule format prior to divisions better than I do, because I don't know that I ever knew how they figured out who was playing who, besides, of course, Ohio State and Michigan are playing. And Ohio State and Penn State, they always play those two. And I always thought that was unfair to those two schools to have to play each other, even though it was a game everyone wanted to see. But Michigan State seemed to be one of those teams that Ohio State saw as infrequently as just about anybody in the conference. There seemed to be, 2-year stretches. They didn't see Michigan State, then they'd play them a few years, and then they wouldn't see them for 2 years. And there were certain teams like that. Purdue, there were gaps in there, but it didn't seem to be equitable.
Yeah, and I'm just trying to think back to the teams that I saw when I was in school there and teams that I didn't get to see. And yeah, it didn't seem like there's a rhyme or reason other than you played most of them because there were only 10, 11 teams at the time. And so it wouldn't be too hard to catch up on the 3 that you didn't see or however many. But I think having a uniform system in terms of how often and knowing that you will play every team in a 4-year span, I think that's a good way to go, and just it allows everybody to benefit from being in that conference. It allows Minnesota to get a home game with Ohio State every 4 years, to get a home game with Michigan every 4 years. Although, there's another thing: Michigan and Minnesota have a rivalry. Are they tied together? Like, do you take that rivalry away? And so there's a lot in there where you have to try to keep all of that going, and it's probably more difficult with a smaller pod than it is with a larger pod.
Got Tony Gerdeman here from Buckeye Scoop. Got about 120 on the line. We appreciate you being here. You can see below on the ticker, we've got a Discord. If you want to talk Ohio State football, college football, sign up on Patreon, and please check out Tony's work. He's certainly a talented writer. So get on over, check out his work at Buckeye Scoop, and also his podcast that is uploaded how often, Tony?
A couple times a week. It's Buckeye Weekly. That's the podcast. During the season and starting of camp, it's about a daily podcast. So it's not the best named podcast.
I didn't think so. Okay.
Buckeye, whatever. If you want to change the name on me there, Mark.
We had a question come in here. We're going to start knocking off these questions as well. And I've lost track of it, but I think I can paraphrase it. Basically, we had Steve Dace from Michigan podcast on. He has his team total talent rankings. And if you understand the premise of that, he's not predicting who's going to win how many games, but he's basically saying this is the measurement of the talent. Well, you would think, okay, it's just a reflection of recruiting rankings. Well, he does adjust it if a player proves to be better than his initial ranking. Tanner Morgan throws 30 touchdowns. He's no longer a low 3-star. He's a mid 4-star. But he doesn't reduce it for guys that underachieve because they still have that potential to achieve that. Okay, I had to tell him he was crazy because I said, I respect your talent rankings and I love what you're doing here. And I think it's credible, but it's not perfect. And it's certainly not perfect because I don't know how you get that Michigan's more talented than Ohio State when, despite the win last year, I don't think they were more talented last year. They lose 2 tremendous, even if they weren't 5 stars, coming in. You got to up their rating to a 5-star, I guess, with Ajabo and Hutchinson. They're gone, and your 1,000-yard back, and Daxton Hill, and da. And I know the Buckeyes lost talent, but to adjust the ranking and bring in 2 5-stars on defense for Ohio State in this recruiting class. Plus, I counted 8 players just on defense ranked in the top 25 at their positions. I just didn't see how that added up. So there was a question here just to get your thoughts about, is Michigan more talented than Ohio State?
Yeah, and I respect what Steve does because he's done this for years. And the rankings, his rankings are what they are. They're not skewed towards Michigan because of, the number of general studies majors or the number of kinesiology majors. You get more points for that. No, it's all about his own system there, and I respect it. And so if that's what it says, it's what it says. However, if that's what it says, you might want to think, is there some bad data going in here? Is there something that needs to be tweaked? Because I'm with you. I don't know how it can be. You mentioned the losses. Daxton Hill is a huge loss for that secondary. I think actually Aiden Hutchinson and David Ajabo is a huge loss for the secondary as well, because they made that secondary very, very good. And now you've lost that. You've lost starting corner. You've lost leading tackler. I don't think the defensive line depth has always been an issue for me for Michigan. And you don't replace those 2 guys you lost, and the guys who will be stepping in for them won't be as good. The offensive line will be okay, but I still think they were overrated last year. Not against Ohio State. They did just fine there. I think having J.J. McCarthy out this spring was a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing in that it didn't create any controversy and nobody transferred. It's a curse in that you need somebody of J.J. McCarthy's potential to take you to the next level, and he missed a spring. And so now you're going to have a situation this season where Cade McNamara, if he's not playing well, you're going to want to put J.J. McCarthy in. J.J. McCarthy is still he'll be semi-experienced at that point and won't necessarily always know when not to do something. And we've seen him make mistakes in the past, and you got to learn from them, but you got to be on the field to learn from them. And so I think the receivers are really good. They've got a lot of them. They've got a lot of decent receivers. I like the running game, the running backs. I just don't see it from the defense, and you lose your defensive coordinator as well. And I would have to. Was it close? Were the 2 rankings close?
Yes, it was close. It was within like 3 points. And what a point means, I don't really know. But when it's 308 and 311, that seems close to me.
Yeah, and I do my own thing with rankings and positional rankings in the spring, and then I'll add them up and see. And that's my prediction for, like, I'll do positional rankings, and then I add them all up after a series of doing these, and that's my predictions on who will be going to the Big Ten championship game. And I had Indiana and Ohio State, I think, really close last year, and clearly my stuff was flawed, and I will admit that. But you tell me that, and if I'm looking at that, I know I trust my data because it's been well. I guess you only trust it. How well has it done in the past? And I think then maybe that's how much you trust it, but also knowing that it's only data, it's not fact.
We are launching a series this week in which we are running down Ohio State opponents week by week, starting with week 1. And so I know everybody's gearing up for the Arkansas State preview next week. But please bear with us. We want to give every opponent his time. So while you're gearing up for Arkansas State and that huge conversation next week, and Toledo the following week, we will suffer through the Notre Dame breakdown here with
Toledo almost beat Notre Dame last year, Mark. So I understand.
Right. Absolutely. But this guy is one of the very best in the business. We got Brian Driscoll here from Irish Breakdown. And Brian, we appreciate your time. So thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me on, Mark.
Well, this one, so if we just take 2 of the best programs and teams in the country, put them together, everybody's geeked up and ready to see that game. But is there more to it than that? Is there more to it because of the proximity of the schools, more to it because of Marcus Freeman now being the head coach? Brian, is there more to it because these are 2 of the very pillars of the sport? all those things make it even better, bigger, more hyped than it would be otherwise?
Oh, absolutely. I think the Marcus Freeman aspect is a part of it. His basically de facto linebackers coach is a former All-American linebacker at Ohio State, James Laurinaitis, who's a GA at Notre Dame. But anyone that's been into practice knows that Al Golden's kind of being the D coordinator, and James Laurinaitis is spending a lot of time with the linebackers. So there's obviously that aspect to it. There's a lot of Ohio guys on Notre Dame's coaching staff. Obviously, Al Washington's an Ohio guy. Mike Mickens is an Ohio guy. So I think those are aspects. And I think the fact, too, that these teams, as with all the tradition that Notre Dame and Ohio State have, they've rarely ever played. I mean, in my lifetime, and I was born in 1978, they've played, I think, twice, right? Or three times, excuse me. Oh, no, in the regular season. I'm talking regular season. They've had a couple bowl games. They had the 05 bowl game in the Fiesta Bowl, and then obviously played it again in 2015. I'm talking like regular season. They just don't play that often. And when you think about the location and all, the fact that Notre Dame used to recruit Ohio a ton under the Lou Holtz era, and obviously, for Jerry Faust, for all his issues, he recruited a lot of Ohio kids to Notre Dame in the early 80s. So it's just one of those things is, I'm a Northwest Ohio guy and growing up a Notre Dame fan, and you're like, why don't these two teams play? I grew up in Lyman. It's like right in between the two of them, and it's like, why don't they play? It's just been the aspect of it. So I think there's also that sort of that uniqueness. This isn't a matchup that we're going to see. Like if Michigan and Notre Dame were playing in the opener, and Michigan's coming off of a playoff appearance and Big Ten championship and all that, it's like, yeah, okay, but we've seen this before, right? We've seen this story before. This has so much more intrigue, and honestly, for Notre Dame guys, it's big because before you get to passing Clemson and Georgia and Alabama, if you're trying to become the premier program, you got to first become the premier program in the Midwest. And right now, that's Ohio State. So beating them on the recruiting trail is part of it, but you got to prove you can beat them on the field. So, if you're talking about that matchup from a Notre Dame standpoint, you've got to be able to do something against the Buckeyes because they're 0-4 in my lifetime against Ohio State. So you've got to be able to prove you can beat them before you can start saying, hey, Alabama, here we come. Like, oh, okay, cool. But you got this team in Columbus you got to beat first.
Yeah, I was a student at Ohio State in 94, 95, 96, and then 97, 98, 99, and 2000. That's a joke. I was only there for 4.5 years. But I remember when that was announced, like Ohio State and Notre Dame were going to be playing it years in advance, obviously, and knowing that I was going to be a student there when that was going on, that was a huge deal to have Notre Dame come to Ohio Stadium, and it was an amazing experience. And the years flew by as you're waiting for that. Like this is going to happen. And when this was announced again, it's like this is something you look forward to. I don't know that either team is looking forward to it being the season opener. I think both programs would prefer it to be, game 2, game 3, something like that. And I'm just interested in your thoughts on this being a season opener, a career opener for Marcus Freeman. It's a tough way to open the season against Ohio State on the road and dealing with all of the expectations and let alone scheming and dealing with Ohio State's offense and all of that. Like, what are your thoughts on this being the opener for Notre Dame?
I like it, to be honest with you. I feel like if Ohio State's your number 2, then you're going to spend the whole fall camp trying to pretend like you care about we only care about the next team on our opponent. No, you don't care about New Mexico. You care about Ohio State, right? I think there's that aspect to it. And I think there's the gamesmanship. Look, I'm a former coach, and I think there's always some gamesmanship to it. Like, okay, we've got a new defensive coordinator just like you do, but like we just spent the whole bowl prep session breaking down that defensive coordinator's film where our defensive coordinator hasn't called a game since 2005, right? So, I mean, there's not a lot of film that, going to go watch Bengal film, from last year. I think there's that. And, there's a new starter quarterback. You don't want to give them a ton of film of what a Tyler Buckner-led offense is going to look like. So there's that gamesmanship to it as well. But I honestly think sometimes having a game like that in game 2 or game 3, if there's kind of cakewalk games, let's say you were to put, Toledo and who Arkansas State beforehand, you run the risk then of, are your guys really locked in for that game? For Notre Dame, they play Marshall and Cal. If you had Marshall and Cal before that, are they really locked in for Marshall and Cal? And, then all of a sudden, next thing you're Notre Dame playing Toledo, and you've got Purdue coming up and Wisconsin coming up, and you don't take Toledo as serious as you need to, and then you're needing a 4-quarter drive to go down and beat them, right? And so I kind of like the idea of it from a Notre Dame standpoint. I think it's a positive, and it's and also there's a notion, look, get that game out of the way, win or lose, right? And then now you can focus on really building your team and getting ready for that October, November stretch, which is going to be pretty challenging for Notre Dame.
Well, and for either team, win or lose, this game isn't going to devastate either of them.
Only if it's a blowout, I think.
Right.
I think that's the only way, right?
And you have the entire season to build back on it. And we see teams, not everybody goes undefeated, and
Right.
there are plenty of one-loss teams in the playoffs. So that's why I love these games, because I can't stand the scheduling where you schedule yourself to go undefeated and you don't really it's okay to have a loss. I mean, especially now with a 4-team playoff, it's okay. And then you also grow from it. I do like the idea of just the mystery aspect of Notre Dame, because you get to see a little bit of what to expect from the offense. But you don't.
So
really
are you saying you wouldn't be excited about starting your season against Colorado State, Hawaii, and UConn? That doesn't excite you? That's not a challenging schedule to get you? No, look, I think it's great for the game.
Those three, Brian.
Yeah. I don't know, some garbage team from up north that I don't think all of us, that's the one thing we can unify around, is that despising that program and its head coach and all of its fan base. But I think it's good for your team too. I do. I think that when you have that challenging game, because to your point, I mean, Ohio State's won one national title in the BC in the playoff era, happened in a year where they lost by 14 points in the second or third game of the year at home to a team that went 7-6, right? But you learn lessons from that game and then you go build. I mean, in 2017, Notre Dame lost to Georgia in the second game of the year. That game was, even though they lost, Notre Dame's players came out of that game like, look, we just went toe to toe with Georgia and we didn't play well. We should have beat them. And that kind of the confidence level that they came out of that game, it's like a week later, they went out and hung 500 plus rushing yards on Boston College. And then a week after that, they went out and beat a 10-win Michigan State team 38-18. And it wasn't that close of a game. And they just steamrolled everybody else. If they'd have beat Georgia State that weekend, I don't know if Notre Dame comes out of that game with the same confidence. You look at Ohio State last year against Oregon, you had some warts exposed in that game. Well, if they don't get exposed until maybe later in the year in a game that matters a little bit more on the committee's standpoint, if you don't have that Oregon game. So, I think games like that are great. I wish we saw more of them. And props to Ohio State for not pulling an Alabama and saying we're going to have it on a neutral field, right? I mean, this is good for college football. And it's good to see teams go on the road, play home and homes, and say, hey, we're going to challenge ourselves early. It's going to be a test for us. We're going to find out where we're strong. We're going to find out some areas maybe we're not as strong. But I promise you this, by the time we go play Penn State, the time we go play Michigan, Ohio State's warts are going to be fixed. Notre Dame, by the time we get Clemson in November, and by the time we go out to LA to play USC, we're going to have a lot of time to kind of fix these issues, because we kind of saw who we were at the beginning. Because the goal for Ohio State's, I would believe, is still to compete for and win a championship, right? And that's what Notre Dame is trying to do. And you don't evaluate yourself based on what you do against North Carolina or a depleted Stanford team or Indiana or Minnesota, teams like that. You do it by saying we're playing other similar caliber teams, and we're going to learn about ourselves from that. That's going to help us get ready to be sure to be ready to do what we need to do in October, November.
Has Tyler Buckner, Brian, shown you anything in limited time, but playing meaningful time against big opponents, that either gives you concern that he's not ready for this or gives you optimism that he is ready for the shoe?
Well, he's a playmaker. I think when we saw him last year, his first sort of coming off the bench in a kind of rotation, just run the ball kind of role was against Virginia Tech last year, right? And he comes out in the first half. He plays just one quarter, goes 5 of 8 for over 100 yards, and turns a 10-0 deficit into a 14-10 lead, right? That's the positive. Well, then Virginia Tech goes in at halftime, makes adjustments. Tyler had been doing, backup reps. It wasn't running the whole offense. They make some adjustments, and he struggles in the second half, right? So I think that game was one of those things where you say, he handled that stadium, that crowd, and Ohio State's familiar with how loud that place can get if Virginia Tech's playing well. And he handled that environment well. It was more of the rolled coverages, the things that a young guy struggle with. So I think he showed the ability to handle the moment. I don't think that's going to be the question for him. And of course, Lane Stadium is loud, but it's not the horseshoe, right? But it's at least an opportunity to do that. It's now about, okay, can you read the defense? Can you make plays? Can you do those type of things? And I think those are the things that Tyler's going to have to learn. But the good thing is when you have a young quarterback that can make the dynamic plays that he can make with his legs, it eliminates some of that need to always be processing information. Because it's like, if he's struggling, hey, just go call a couple runs and let him do something there to maybe slow down that pass rush, or maybe to mix up the coverages, or whatever the case may be. And I think, that's something that I think Tommy Rees is going to have in his back pocket to say, look, if we need to get him comfortable, we can always do a couple, read zones or some quick RPOs to let him get into the mix and get him into the flow. And hopefully you're able to run the football. I think that's going to be the big thing is Notre Dame's ability to get Tyler Buckner comfortable in that game is going to have a lot more to do with what you do with your big guys up front against Ohio State. Notre Dame didn't run the ball very well last year. Ohio State didn't stop the run very well last year. Well, they've both got new leadership, right? Notre Dame's got Harry Hiestand now. Ohio State's got Jim Knowles. How will those two teams adapt? I think that's going to be the question. But Notre Dame's going to have to run the ball to take that pressure off Tyler Buckner. But the nice thing for him is he can be part of that running aspect. I think I was told by someone at Notre Dame that they averaged like 8 yards a carry last year on inside zone with Tyler Buckner in the game, because you have to respect his ability to pull it and run it. And, we'll see how Ohio State's going to be able to handle that. And we'll see if Notre Dame can block it up and get him free and design ways to get him in some matchups where he can take advantage of that athleticism.
It will be interesting to see how Ohio State handles that inside run with their 4-2-5, and do they have to adjust to a 4-3 or something like that to get more people in the mix there? And yeah, I'm just looking forward to and then what happens in the second half, because the adjustments that both programs are going to be going through. Do you think that with Marcus Freeman, obviously a lot of programs wanted him, Notre Dame wanted to keep him, but was there, I'll ask this gently, was this a panic hire to keep him from leaving?
Yeah, no, it wasn't. And so what understand is Jack Swarbrick kind of viewed Marcus as the successor to Brian Kelly. I just don't think Jack Swarbrick knew it was going to be after a year. I don't think anybody really knew Brian Kelly was going to leave that quickly, but we all knew Brian Kelly's time was coming to an end. And that's why Notre Dame, like Notre Dame did something with Marcus Freeman they've never done before, and that was they got into a bidding war to get him. They didn't do that just to have him as his defensive coordinator. There was always an end game in mind. And look, Luke Fickell expressed interest in the job. It never went to the point where would he take it or not. There was other coaches that Mike Campbell had expressed interest in the job. There's a couple other coaches I can't name that are big names that had expressed interest in the job. But it was just obvious to Jack Swarbrick that this is the guy. The players wanted him. The alumni loved him. He understands Notre Dame in a way that Brian Kelly never even tried to understand. And it's like, look, there's always a risk hiring a young coach, but I think there's enough evidence for Notre Dame in recent history, including Ohio State, including Oklahoma, Clemson with Dabo Swinney. We've seen a lot of guys kind of get their start on that big stage. We can say, look, we've seen it. As long as you put a good enough staff around him, he's got the chops, right? Because I think at the end of the day, guys, that's what I care about. I mean, we've seen veteran defensive coordinators, guys have been coaching a long time, come into a job and stink. We've seen young guys take over jobs and be good at it. If you got the chops, you got the chops. I've always believed that as a coach. But you think about who are the programs you're trying to be. You're trying to have the success of getting multiple playoffs like Oklahoma had with a head coach that had never been, who was in his 30s and never been a head coach before. Ohio State, in the tremendous run they've been on since Ryan Day got here, never been a head coach. I believe was in his 30s when he got the job, right? Dabo Swinney he'd never been a coordinator when he got the Clemson job, right? So now the situations are different in every instance. Dabo was replacing a coach that had failed. Lincoln and Ryan Day were replacing coaches that had succeeded. That's more in line with what Marcus Freeman's going through. So it was not a panic hire. Now, it may not be the right hire. We'll find that out in time, but it wasn't a panic hire. There was enough coaches that had expressed interest in the job. And Notre Dame had expressed interest in saying, hey, look, we don't really care about the Fiesta Bowl. The job here is to get the right hire. If we've got to wait till after the playoff to hire Luke Fickell, Notre Dame was more than ready to do that, because at the end of the day, they were comfortable with that. It's just that after a second interview, it just was obvious that they felt Marcus Freeman was that guy. And so far, he's done a great job, right? I mean, you look at the staff he's put together. I mean, to me, that's the sign of, are you a mature coach? Is do you surround yourself with other really good coaches? I understand my weakness as a head coach is inexperience. So what am I going to do? I'm going to go hire Al Golden. who's in his 50s to run my defense, who's been a head coach, who's been in the NFL. You bring back Harry Heastand, who's one of the best in the business at what he does. You bring in Jared Parker, who's got experience coaching the Big Ten. He was an interim head coach at Purdue, and he's somebody you trust. Al Washington, someone who a year ago people were talking about, maybe being a Tennessee defensive coordinator candidate. So he did a really tremendous job, in my opinion, of hiring a nice blend of young and older experienced coaches. So far, so good in regards to putting together his staff and building his team. Now we've got to see if he can motivate a team and get them in the right direction and go coach in game. That remains to be seen. But so far, I'm pleased with the job he's been able to do.
Yeah, because when it's the players and the alumni that choose the coach, there's all kinds of danger there. But I also see this more as the Bob Stoops handing it over to Lincoln Riley, Urban Meyer handing it over to Ryan Day. Like
they just have more class than Brian Kelly. That's the difference.
But like when and Jack Swarbrick, like when like I would be okay with this guy taking over. I go back to I think 2016. I was at the Big Ten Media Days talking to Darrell Hazel. Marcus Freeman was the linebackers coach at Purdue at the time, and he said, because I was asking him about Marcus Freeman, former Buckeye, let's talk about him. And he's like, this guy is a future star. He's like, he's going to be a star in business. He's going to be a head coach, and it won't be too long. And then I was talking to Juwan Bentley, linebacker for Purdue at the time, and everything he told me about Marcus Freeman is everything that Marcus Freeman and James Laurinaitis had told me about Luke Fickell. Like they were the same person, the same kind of coach, and Marcus Freeman has learned from Luke Fickell, learned from Jim Tressel, and very different than Jim Tressel, very different than Brian Kelly in terms of care, I think, in that respects, and different.
And Marcus Freeman's a polar opposite of Brian Kelly in that regard.
Exactly, and that's somebody that everybody can get behind. I think it's also something that recruits can get behind, and I think that's where you've got an even more upside there. It's like, yes, we'll figure out how it goes on the field, but recruiting, it's hard to dislike Marcus Freeman, and it's not so hard to dislike Brian Kelly.
No, it's actually harder to like him. I mean, and that was when he was winning. I mean, Mark knows this. Mark, you've known me for a couple of years now. Even when Notre Dame was winning games, I just he wasn't just because he's not a good guy. And that's the thing. It's like, look, is Ryan Day as good of a head coach as Urban Meyer? He hasn't proven that yet. He doesn't have 3 titles, but he's a lot more likable. It's just like, I can root for that guy. I know a lot of people hate on Dabo. I like Dabo. I like Dabo a whole lot more than I like Nick Saban. He's just a more likable guy. But, likability and all that at the end of the day is not going to win you a championship. And recruiting only takes you so far, right? And for all the talent that Georgia's recruited and they've gotten to that state, if Alabama isn't down their 2 best receivers by halftime, they beat Georgia. I mean, with 15 draftable players, right? Get a little air quotes a little tighter here so y'all can see that. But I think you got to be able to coach, and that's what Marcus Freeman's got to prove. I mean, the recruiting thing, yes. I mean, look, Notre Dame's got the number 1 recruiting class in the country right now. It's not even close. They have 12 kids committed, and they're all 12 4 or 5 stars on the Rivals rankings. I mean, I think 9 of their kids are ranked as like top 250 kids, and they're on the verge of potentially landing a few more big time players. So, but now you got to go out and prove that you can coach, because the 23 class may be great because they're riding that wave of momentum. But if you don't prove you can coach, the 24 class won't build on that. And that, at the end of the day, that's what he's got to do. Is it's not that one great class. It's stringing great classes and really good classes on top of each other. And that ultimately only happens if you're able to show you can win.
I don't think there's any question that anyone that follows college football reasonably is impressed with Marcus Freeman, both from what he's produced on the field and then also just to hear him speak, and people gravitate to him. Young men gravitate to his leadership. But I got to admit, Brian, that I am a bit taken back at your level and other Notre Dame media level confidence that, okay, taking Brian Kelly, and despite a few warts on his resume, it's still a tremendous trajectory that he took this program on, the best since Lou Holtz. The unabashed elation over the hire of Marcus Freeman in replacing Brian Kelly.
Well, look, I think he's going to do a good job, but as I've said here, he's got to prove a lot, right? But here's the thing that drives me nuts about the love for Brian Kelly. Number one is anyone that followed the program and is an objective and honest person, not afraid to speak the truth, is going to tell you Brian Kelly wasn't even around half the time. I mean, I've heard this from former players, captains, guys in the NFL. He would meet us when we returned for January, and we wouldn't see him until spring ball started. And same thing would happen over the summer. They'd have to have all their recruiting weekends in one weekend because Brian Kelly's on vacation this week and that weekend, right? They won because, and as far as they said, well, look at the hires he made. Jack Swarbrick and Chad Klunder are the ones that drove the hires for Mike Elko and Chip Long. And then Mike Elko is the one that pushed to bring in Clark Lee because Brian Kelly was trying to leave Notre Dame at the time because they just gone 4-8. He wanted out. It was Swarbrick. And then when no one would hire him because you just went 4-8 against a terribly easy schedule where you lost a 3-9 Michigan State, 4-8 Duke, and you go out there and you have that level of success. You say, well, he deserves all the credit. He was going to hire a strength coach from USC until Bob Diaco called him and said, you got to hire Matt Bayless. Like, he was my guy at UConn. Look what he's done. We just got fired. You got to hire this guy. So it's like, well, what exactly should I give Brian Kelly credit for? And say, well, Notre Dame went 32-5 the last 3 years. They went 3-5 against teams that finished in the year top 25. They went 11-2 this year. You know how many ranked teams they beat? Teams that were ranked at the end of the year? 0. They beat one ranked team in 2019. It was Navy. That's it, right? You don't get hired at Notre Dame to beat a bunch of nobodies. You get hired to beat the best teams in the country. Not only did they not beat the best teams in the country, they were usually not even competitive against the best teams in the country. And the only time they were was when Clemson didn't have Trevor Lawrence and their 3 best starters on defense. And they still needed double overtime to win that game, right? So that's why I have the disdain for Brian Kelly. He had no respect for Notre Dame and his traditions. He would constantly throw his players under the bus, right? Like it's his center's fault that he can't snap in a hurricane, not my fault that I kept going shotgun and calling pass plays in the middle of a hurricane, right? It's Deshaun Kaiser's fault or Justin Yoon's fault or my center's fault. He was like that his whole career. And he never gave credit to the people that deserved it, which was the coaches that were coaching their butts off and the players while he was out playing golf or shaking this person's hand or having this person tell him how wonderful he is. And that's why you saw such a universal acceptance of Marcus Freeman, because he's the anti-Brian Kelly. He cares about the kids. He loves Notre Dame and embraces Notre Dame. He's one of the most genuine coaches you're going to meet. And I'm sure Tony will tell you there's not a lot of genuine coaches at this level. There's just not. It's like Ohio State has one. Tony Alford's one of my favorite coaches because love him or hate him, that's who Tony is, right? He is a genuine guy. And that's why I have so much respect for him. And that's how Marcus Freeman is. And that's why you see alums. They had 300 alums come back for the spring game, right? Notre Dame alums aren't all hanging out in northern Indiana, right? They're across the country, sometimes the world, because there's an excitement around Notre Dame because they actually feel like they have someone who gives a rip about them. I think that's why there's the acceptance, is because it's not even just about can he win or not. It's just, but it's just like sometimes, you're winning, but there's just still this dark cloud around. You're not enjoying it. There's just this negativity. It's like, I said this when Jim Harbaugh was with the Niners. I said the first bad season he has, they're going to be out because you better win because it's a miserable experience. And that's what Notre Dame went through. So maybe Marcus Freeman won't be able to coach. I don't know. But he's going to look out for his players. He's going to have their backs. He's going to love Notre Dame. And as we've seen, he's going to recruit his butt off. And as long as you have talent, you got a chance to win beat a bunch of teams. There's no doubt about it.
I also think he can be a lifer there and won't be looking for the next thing where, Brian Kelly, you'd hear his name floated around every now and again. I am disappointed, though, with Marcus Freeman's turn to coaching, because when he was playing and James Laurinaitis were playing, and obviously James Laurinaitis' father was a professional wrestler, one of the 2 Road Warriors, they had talked about when their playing days were over, getting into wrestling and being a tag team. And I thought, maybe those 2 guys could bring back the Road Warriors, the new generation of the Road Warriors. Now it's probably not going to happen, and it's a little bit disappointing.
Yeah, I understand that. Yeah, I understand that. I mean, I'm a child of, I don't know how old you are, but I'm in my mid-40s, so I grew up in that era, right? Mm-hmm. Road Warriors versus Demolition. So, that would have been fun to see. That'd have been fun to see. I'm actually, as a Notre Dame fan, I'm glad he didn't go down that route. Both of them didn't go down that route. I think it's going to pay off well for Notre Dame. But, I can, as an 80s child of the WWF, right? Yeah, I'm with you on that.
Please hit the like button, everyone. Treasure the Toro. We appreciate your contribution. We also have a super chat coming in from Cameron Gant. Cameron asking Brian, how confident is Notre Dame that Ohio State won't flip? So Keon Keeley, for anyone who doesn't know, top 10 player in the nation, committed to Notre Dame, top edge rusher according to the composite, top 3 player in the state of Florida.
Very.
Okay.
It's not one I'm overly concerned about. I mean, I'm not saying Keon Kidd is going to sign with Notre Dame, but I don't. If he flips from Notre Dame, he's going to stay in the South. He's not going to go to Ohio State.
All right.
And the other aspect in that is Larry Johnson. Right now, anytime he's recruiting against schools are telling those players, well, he's not going to be around for much longer. He's going to be retiring. So it's tough as well to flip guys who are already committed in that respect.
Brian, the point spread's something like 10.5. I know you're not a point spread guy. Ohio State fans, as you may be noticing in the chat, are rather confident that this is just an Ohio State win. I'm guessing the Notre Dame fans are more like, we can compete, we can win this game. I think it's going to be a heck of a game. What's your confidence level 3 months away, 4 months away?
I'm not even there yet. I'm worried about getting to fall camp healthy. I mean, that's the coach in me, right? I'm not worried about that just yet. Look, here's the reality of it. If you want fans like Ohio State fans and Bama fans and Clemson fans to just stop assuming you're going to get your butt kicked when you play them, then stop getting your butt kicked when you go play them. It's as simple as that. So, so are you upset that it's a 10.5 point spread? I'm like, have you seen what Notre Dame has done in the past against teams ranked in the top 10? It's not pretty. Brian Kelly has a career 3-17 record against top 10 teams that finished in the top 10. And one of those wins was against a Michigan State team that at the time was unranked back in 2013. So no, I haven't thought a lot about the point spread, but we've got to see a lot. We've got to see how Tyler Buckner develops in the spring. Can he stay healthy? And also, point spreads to me are little. I mean, like the Ohio State game in 2015, right? And Notre Dame had it down to a 7-point game in the third quarter. Like they just scored. It's kind of like, yeah, but it really wasn't that competitive of a game. It's like I've had a friend that argued with me about this, about the Michigan. Remember was it 4-15 where Ohio State was like barely beating Michigan at halftime, and my buddy was like, "This is a really close game." I'm like, "Are you watching the same game I'm watching? Because this is." Ohio State's like fumbling around, like they're going to blow Michigan out in the second half, and that's exactly what happened. So, end of the day, you could be up down 4. You're driving late in the game, and you're trying to win it, and you've got to go for it on 4th down, and they pick it off, run it back. You lost by 11, right? I mean, that's why I hate point spreads. You just never know how a game is going to end. So, right now, if Notre Dame wants to not be 10-point underdogs to Ohio State or not be a home underdog to Clemson, prove that you can win these games without needing their starting quarterback and 3 best defensive players to be out for the game.
I did like during the NFL draft, the pregame show of the draft, ESPN had Marcus Freeman and Ryan Day on the same set and made mention to Marcus Freeman of the line. And Ryan Day was like, we don't need to be talking about that. And Marcus Freeman is like, keep talking about it.
Yeah, because it's motivation for the players, right? I mean, but at the end of the day, motivation only takes you so far. Once the ball snapped, you're not winning a game because you were an underdog. You're winning that game because you prepared and you executed at a high level. And that at the end of the day. But yes, I'm not going to lie and say that I wouldn't like the spread to get even more, because I think for Notre Dame, it gives you that disrespect card, and sometimes if you're really coached well and you have good leadership, you don't lose that. Even if you go out and beat Ohio State, or maybe it's a like the Georgia game in 2019 and the Georgia game in 2017 and 19, Notre Dame had the ball in the 4th quarter with a chance to win both games. You fell short and say, hey, you know what? Let's improve. Let's make some corrections, because we almost beat that team, and next time we're going to get our shot. But I hope it's a bigger game, but we'll have to see.
Yeah,
bigger and faster. I don't know about the bigger part, maybe the faster part, but
yeah, the line, I don't think it does much. It'll do a little bit of motivation. The most motivation that I've ever seen on this beat and watching is after Ohio State lost to Clemson in the playoffs the first time, they were motivated all year long, and then they got to play them again in 2020, and you saw it happen, and that was their motivation. And
they had a game in between that.
Well, from 2019, they had an entire season, but they were motivated by that playoff loss to Clemson in 2020.
About the one in 16 or the one in 19?
19.
Okay, gotcha.
And then they beat them in 2020 in the playoffs, going to the championship game.
Well, Clemson had that in 2015. They had that close loss to Bama, and like, hey, you know what? Like, we can play with these guys. And then it did serve as motivation. But at the end of the day, do you have a good game plan? Right. Can you execute that game plan? And do you have enough talent to outplay that team? I mean, Utah, to me, I thought outplayed Ohio State for most of that game, but they still lost because Ohio State had way better players. I mean, that at the end of the day, motivation only takes. As a coach, look, I've been there. We've done the whole play the disrespect card, but once the ball snapped, you get in the mouth. Nobody's thinking about what the point spread is. That's the reality of it, right? For either team.
Ohio State fans only have to go back 5 or 6 months to the Oregon game and remember what that point spread was. What, 14.5, Tony?
Yeah, something like that. It was too high, it turns out.
Yeah, well, and we've seen that from Ohio State in Septembers before. I mean, that's the thing is why I think point spreads early in the seasons are kind of nonsense. I mean, what was this point spread for Notre Dame going into Toledo game last year, right? Like, you really don't know what either one of these teams are going to be, and that's why I don't bet. But it's definitely why I would never bet on openers or games in the first month of the season because you don't know what these teams are going to be.
Especially when you're just trying to get out with a 1-point win any way you can. That's all you care about.
That's it. That's it. No, and I'll say this. I mean, Ohio State may be faster than Notre Dame, but they're definitely not bigger than Notre Dame, especially when you look at the Notre Dame offensive line against the Michigan defense or the Ohio State defensive line.
Well, especially if Ohio State is playing a 4-2-5, they've shrunk themselves by the process of it.
Right.
Yes, it will be something to behold. And back to the betting portion of this, it's one of the reasons why I tell people that actually the prediction record against the money line, just saying who's going to win and is actually a more valid prediction. Obviously, it's going to be a higher percentage, but it's actually a more valid prediction than picking against the spread. Nobody quite understands my point there, but it's the point that Brian was making about having a beat on the game and thinking, okay, this thing's playing out exactly the way I thought. And then suddenly there's a scoop and score with 32 seconds left that doesn't have anything
or the other way around
of the game.
What if Ohio State's up by 17 and they're thoroughly out playing Notre Dame and Notre Dame gets a garbage touchdown at the end to make it a 10-point win? Okay, you didn't cover, right? You lost, even though, the game kind of played out like that type of line would otherwise determine. Yep. So it's just one of a million reasons that, and I'm really cheap and tight. So that's just one of the many reasons I don't bet.
That's a wise move on your part. That's a wise move on your part. Brian Driscoll, Irish Breakdown. It is an amazing platform that they have there. So please check it out with Brian, whether you're a Notre Dame fan. If you're a Notre Dame fan, I can't imagine. And Brian, I was going to say your name and information there looks really good in scarlet, if you didn't notice.
Yeah. I want to barf, but I'll wait till after I get off the show.
Okay.
You got to understand, I grew up in Northwest Ohio. I'm surrounded by Ohio State fans. I've been seeing this stinking scarlet my whole life, but, I'm used to it by now.
Then it begs the question, where did it all go wrong?
Well, I mean, I think it all went right because I was also a Denver Bronco fan growing up in Northwest Ohio, and so I had to deal with all that nonsense about we're going to beat you in the AFC Championship, and that never happened. So I'll take all those, all those dubs and those. But no, my dad was a Notre Dame fan. He grew up in Norfolk, Virginia, and was listening to the Lindsey Nelson replays on Sundays, and he just there wasn't any college football in the Mid-Atlantic area in the 70s, 60s, and 70s, and that just kind of became my fan or my team as well. Because my dad, you got to remember, when I was 10 years old and kind of in my formative years, I was 88, 89, 90. Like Notre Dame was the modern day, Clemson or Alabama back then, and that was so. It's like, man, this is going to be fun. Little did I know what was coming afterwards, but yeah, I've just been. Notre Dame.
Well, to Tony's point, and I'm a few years older than Tony, when that Ohio State Notre Dame series of 95-96 was announced, it was like 1988, 89. Yeah. And I remember being surrounded by a few Notre Dame fans who were like, we're going to kick your ass. And I was like, yeah, this may be ugly. Because at that point.
Right. It's like the Bama. Notre Dame plays Bama in 28, 29. Like, oh, you're going to get killed. I'm like, do we really have any clue what either one of these teams is going to look like in 28 or 29? I have no idea, but yeah, I wish those games would have been like, because those, especially the team with Eddie George, like I would have loved seeing that Ohio State team against one of the vintage Notre Dame teams of 88 to 93. That'd have been such a great game. And at the end of the day, Mark, my stance on this. I'm a Notre Dame fan. I don't apologize for that, but I also love college football. And I think games like this are great for college football. I think we need to see more of this. We need to see more of Oklahoma playing Ohio State and Notre Dame playing Clemson and home and homes and, games like that. I'm so tired of the that's why I get respect for Georgia, right? I got a ton of respect for Georgia and Auburn, and I have none for Bama because Georgia will go to South Bend and play Notre Dame, right? Nick Saban doesn't schedule that game until basically he's going to be 80 and retired, right? Like, that's what college football should be about. And to Tony's earlier point, I think it's good for teams to have that. Get that early season game, because if Notre Dame loses to Ohio State or Ohio State loses to Notre Dame and they run the loser runs the table the rest of the way, they're probably still a playoff team as long as it wasn't like a 30-point loss, right? And so, I mean, if Ohio State can sustain a 14-point loss to Virginia Tech, who went 7-6 and still make the playoff, then, but I think it makes you a better team. But more importantly, it's great for the game. It's great for fans. It's great for the kids. Be able to have that kind of experience. Hey, I played against Ohio State, or I played against Notre Dame. And that's why I love games like this. And I wish we would see more of it, to be honest with you.
We have an unbiased perspective here at the Voice of College Football, so we will allow Dave to get his comment in here. He's cheering for the comment. Michigan fan.
Understandable.
Well,
all right.
The thing he fails to realize is Ohio is not that far from Michigan. So if a comment hits Ohio, it is going to impact Michigan in some form or fashion.
It's a Michigan fan. Do you really expect that level of? I'm joking, kind of.
And also your Yankees, if you're a Michigan fan, the Yankees are going to be destroyed. The Cowboys are going to be destroyed.
Sure. Teams that win, there you go.
Brian Driscoll, Irish Breakdown. You got to catch him right there. Brian, let everyone know where they can find you, both you and your podcast and site.
Well, obviously, our website is irishbreakdown.com. We also have a premium message board you can join. You can find that at irishbreakdown.com. If you go to YouTube, our Irish Breakdown / Notre Dame football channel, and obviously you can look at everywhere you can find a podcast, you will find the Irish Breakdown podcast. So give us a subscribe. And if you're listening to our podcast anytime, give us a 5-star review. We greatly appreciate that. But we also welcome other fans. We have a USC fan that comes in our chat all the time. We have a Bama fan that comes in our chat all the time. As long as you come and you're willing to talk ball and not just be an idiot like LSU and Michigan fan. We actually have a good Michigan fan lately, but LSU fans have no ability to act with any sense whatsoever. So we boot all them. But if you want to come talk ball, we'd love it. We'll embrace it. We'll welcome you. And sometimes we'll be having a show and there's like this whole different chat going on with our resident Bama fan and Notre Dame fans. And they're talking ball. It's respectful. And so I think most fan bases, at least Notre Dame fans, they love Notre Dame, but they love college football and they love talking college football. And that's what we try to make our channel be about.
Tony.
Well, I would also say, as a fellow Northwest Ohio child, Notre Dame was my number 2 team. I used to tape the games on the VCR. The Michigan game where Rocket had 2 touchdowns, 89.
Oh, Schembecker, we're not afraid to kick to him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well,
maybe you should have been.
Mm-hmm. That's why Tony Rice, all those guys, all of those great running backs at Notre Dame. We grew up watching them and enjoying them until I got to high school, and then the Notre Dame fans were just insufferable. So if you're from Northwest Ohio, it's Ohio State, it's Notre Dame, it's Michigan, it's one of those 3, and that's about it. But you can find me at buckeyescoop.com, on Twitter at Tony Gerdeman, and of course the podcast is the Buckeye Weekly Podcast on all of your platforms.
And we can all agree on whatever show is up next here at the Voice of College Football. And speaking of which, hey, Wolverines live at 5 Eastern. Yes, be here for that. Guys, it was a great conversation. Appreciate both of you. Thanks for being here. And it should be something else. And Brian, would love to have you back to talk Notre Dame again. Thanks,
Mark. Thanks, Tony. Appreciate you guys.
All right. We'll see everybody back here next Wednesday.